So we've got an amazing session happening now. I'm sure you're going to be really engaged with this session. A session where we're looking at governance and policy. A session where we hear about a whole range of organisations who are struggling with this and making things work. And thank you for being so willing to have your photograph taken, and it'll be up on the Planetary Health Alliance website. And I think it's just good to begin to sort of point and say, I was there, I was with all these people making these important decisions and having these thoughts on thinking, how do we take things forward with the planetary health agenda? So I'm going to call now Anne Kurth. Anne is the president of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, as well as the professor of nursing at Yale University. And Anne is going to moderate the session and introduce everyone else. Thank you. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Liz. So let's just take a very quick poll, because I was really impressed by our younger participants today, that they are actually engaging in political processes and learning how to be politicians. Has anybody here ever run for office or held a public office? Okay, a few. Voluntary sort of offices, school boards, that kind of thing? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, this is a group of pragmatists, yes? It's not enough to know, we must do, we must act. And so this session 6, is about the governance and policy space for solutions. So let me just give you the quick rundown about how we're going to move through it. We have 2 hours together, and following adults' learning principles, we will try to sort of separate the beginning set of speakers and have a bit of conversation at the end of that first set of speakers. And then I will turn it over to Natalia Lanu, who will then be leading a conversation with the second set of speakers, and we will then do some Q&A at the end as well. So we're going to break it up a little bit in that way. So let me begin, though, by introducing Mandeep Dhaliwal. She's going to give our keynote for this session. She's the director of the UN Development Program on HIV, Health, and Development Practice. Mandeep is a lawyer and a founding coordinator of the Lawyers Collective HIV/AIDS unit. So, Mandeep, welcome.
Thanks very much. And I was just saying to Phil, post-lunch, 2 hours on policy. I hope we're going to manage to keep people awake. And it's also not nice to follow the children, because I think you can't be nearly as interesting as those kids were. It's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for an opportunity to address this conference. And I think some of you may be wondering, what's an HIV person doing talking at this conference? And I hope that's going to become clear as I make my remarks. Planetary health is a powerful frame for those of us who are development practitioners, because we see the complexity and the interconnectedness of health, environment, and development challenges in our daily work. As the administrator of UNDP said this morning in his opening, or yesterday actually, in his video message, achieving the SDGs will require concerted action at the nexus of health and environment, because our survival and the survival of future generations relies on the health of our planet. Working in silos on a single health or development priority will not get us to the sustainability, which is really the clarion call of the Sustainable Development Goals and the commitment to leave no one behind. But action across sectors and involving diverse stakeholders is not without its challenges. Most importantly, it involves talking to people who don't speak your language, or people who may have different priorities, or at its worst, people who fundamentally disagree with you. So my remarks today are going to focus both on challenges and opportunities for solutions. At the outset, let me stress, as someone who's spent a significant portion of my career in the global AIDS response, that I believe there are many lessons that we can draw from the struggle to end AIDS and our broader efforts to reduce health inequities and reach the most vulnerable. Indeed, the most fundamental barrier to action and change from the AIDS response and from many other issues comes down to power and how power is exercised. Health challenges which disproportionately impact the poor or marginalized are often neglected, and solutions often come too late or are not shared and are always underfunded. And that's why UNDP, as a development agency, works across our network of 170 countries and is committed to eradicating poverty and reducing inequalities, and that's why we're interested in the planetary health agenda. As is the case for the AIDS response, we must chart a course through the complexity, the interconnections, and the magnitudes of what needs to be done. I think for everybody who heard all the research presentations yesterday, you could be easily overwhelmed by what needs to be done to deliver on the challenge of planetary health. But we really need to see our way through in a very pragmatic and constructive way. Addressing planetary health is our shared moral imperative to ensure the well-being of this and future generations. And I want to start with 3 key elements that I think are essential for developing scalable solutions for planetary health. One is to build and share the evidence base for action. We need to look at what works and what doesn't work in terms of laws, policies, and programs. And we heard compelling findings yesterday from researchers. For example, on pollution. 9 million premature deaths a year can be attributed to pollution. These are powerful figures and can effectively communicate urgency to policymakers. However, it's equally important for policymakers to understand the more complex models and systems thinking to help decision makers understand the dynamic interactions, feedback loops, interconnections, and potential for co-benefits and trade-offs. The second element is to understand and act on barriers to action that cannot be overcome through a simple technical fix. For most planetary health challenges, there is no medicine or cure to be developed. The health sector alone or the environment sector alone cannot deliver solutions. This is where organizations such as UNDP can help in identifying and dealing with political, financial, and governance challenges that are holding back progress, and most critically, help in facilitating multi-sectoral solutions. 3 is to build and broaden and bring to scale the necessary coalitions for change. Bringing ambitious solutions requires both top-down and bottom-up engagement, leaders to be bold and visionary, and active civil society to demand change and hold leaders accountable. And we need new leaders like the children from the Children's Parliament. Let's make sure that we listen to the voices of those most affected, including the poor and the youth, who have the most to lose by our inaction today, and develop the joint narrative that is focused on solutions. Ultimately, planetary health is at its core an agenda for equity and justice that requires solutions at scale. So these are not 3 interdependent elements. They don't happen in a linear manner. And that's the wonderful thing about this conference, is that we have so many different constituencies and sectors here. And we each have our distinct contributions to make. But none of us can deliver any results of any substance working in isolation. So for the rest of my remarks, I want to focus a little bit more on some of the political barriers and incentives that we need for action. Unfortunately, simply providing policymakers with compelling evidence, simple figures, does not automatically result in action. We must consider some key elements. The first is timing. The second, competing interests, vested interests, and policy incoherence. And finally, financing and governance. There's a growing literature drawing on behavioral insights to better explain decision-making. One particularly relevant issue that resonates when we think about planetary health is known in the literature as present bias. It relates to the human tendency to discount our future selves and care more about the present. Present bias results in people, including politicians and donors and their constituencies, valuing immediate benefits much more than future costs, making it difficult to mobilize around some of the most pressing challenges of our time, including climate change. Present bias for politicians is compounded by the fact that elected officials often need to show results during their political tenure. And that's often not long enough to be able to demonstrate the benefit of regulations or policies or laws, which often have a longer-term impact many years down the line. But I believe health impacts can be a compelling way to deal with present bias in this field. For example, we saw this in China, where the public demanded greater action on smog and air pollution, largely because of health. And this has led to a shift in China's engagement and commitment to tackling climate change. Moving on now to competing interests and policy incoherence. Beyond individual biases and incentives, there are also real competing interests which need to be identified and managed. For example, while the health and environment communities may jointly and effectively advocate for more stringent regulation around plastics, including restricting single use, such as the bans on plastic bags we've seen in places like Rwanda, France, Mexico City, Montreal, there's also been real pushback from plastics industry and retailers who rely on these bags or plastic for their packaging. We need to better understand the positions of different stakeholders, as we have done, for example, in our thinking related to obesity and sugar-sweetened beverage industries, to see if industry interference is impeding progress in some areas. And we need to make the case in economic terms and be frank about dealing with conflict of interest to really show the cost of inaction on planetary health. It's also necessary to talk about policy incoherence, which often impedes government action, especially multi-sectoral action. For example, today, 6.5% of global GDP goes to subsidizing dirty fossil fuels, while air pollution, to a large extent, due to the burning of solid fuels, kills 7 million people annually and costs our economy over $200 billion in lost labor income. Understanding and articulating the trade-offs, vested interests, and places where policy incoherence is resulting in an inefficient use of resources and is causing harm is an important step in changing policy. Finally, on to financing and governance. Some attention has been given to the insufficiency of financing for the planetary health agenda, as well as to the inadequacy of governance structures. Unfortunately, and this is obviously, it sounds like really obvious, but it's an important observation in terms of how we move forward. Within countries, a siloed approach is entrenched and reflected in the way that ministries are set up and financed. So you have a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Environment, don't necessarily talk to each other, don't necessarily talk to the financing ministry or the planning ministry. UNDP has been exploring ways to disrupt this siloed approach by supporting thematic cross-sectoral action, for example, on tobacco control or the introduction of new health technologies, bringing different ministries around the table, and by piloting methodologies for co-financing, where there are co-benefits across sectors. The term of tragedy of commons has been used to describe why we as a species have continued to exploit our planet in a way that serves individuals in the short term, but is actually harming us all and harming future generations. However, I'm optimistic because I see significant efforts to better manage natural resources, including through economic and cultural, and as we heard from Elder Francois yesterday, in some cases, spiritual valuation. I'm also optimistic because the SDGs place a stronger than ever premium on partnerships and integration. Within the United Nations, this is resulting in more explicit attention to working in partnership and working with greater efficiencies for impact. For example, we see a greater appetite for collaboration on environment and health, and a call from member states, from countries, to increase work at the nexus of health and environment. The themes of the last two UN Environment Assemblies were specifically on environment and health and on pollution. This year, just this month, my organization, UNDP, and the World Health Organization signed an agreement committing our organizations to scale up multi-sectoral responses to the health challenges arising from climate change and environmental problems, building on some of our previous work. For example, we were funded by the Global Environment Facility to help build the adaptive capacity of national health systems to climate change in a number of countries. Between 2010 and 2015, this work helped to introduce early warning systems for climate-related disease outbreaks and established multi-sectoral, multi-ministry national steering committees to address some of the complex challenges related to climate change and health and ensure that national adaptation plans included health concerns. I'm also optimistic because the global community and individual countries and cities seem to be embracing the planetary health agenda, and we've heard lots of examples, and we're going to hear more of these in the coming days. They're experimenting with new ideas and new solutions every day. The question is, how do we take these innovations to scale? So the time is ripe, I think, as Liz said, for an inclusive movement on planetary health, bringing together different disciplines, sectors, and communities, working to advance social justice, environmental protection, sustainability, and health equity. And I'm very pleased to be able to commit UNDP to being a bigger part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandeep, for reminding us that advocacy can work, as we've seen in terms of HIV, the global pandemic, and access to antiretrovirals, and human rights needing to be embedded in that, but also the importance of working with governments and across governments. So appreciate that. Our next speaker will be Phil Mackey. He is a public health specialist. He's lead consultant for the Scottish Managed Sustainable Health Network and the Scottish Public Health Network, and he'll talk to us about co-benefits.
Thank you very much. Big title. I leave you to read it for yourselves while I give out a big thank you to my co-authors of this presentation. Joanna Tewton from NHS Health Scotland, Colin Ramsey from Health Protection Scotland. There are Health Improvement and our Communicable Disease and Civil Contingency Agencies, respectively. To Peter Rawcliffe from the Scottish Natural Heritage Agency, John Redshaw from the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and my colleague Anne Conacher from ScotFin. So why are we talking to you academics? We're not academics. We're the people on the receiving end. We're the people who actually have this problem of being sufficiently informed by what academics do to try and persuade decision makers, policy writers, people with money to make this about the real world. And of course, we do that, but we do it in our own way, because as we all know, evidence of itself is not necessarily sufficient. I'd love to be able to present you a killer slide, the one thing that's going to change your world forever. But I can't. What I can show you are some interesting slides about the fact that, in the main, just as you have problems with trying to understand the sort of governance that we work with, we have problems because the governance gets in the way. As a series of 4 major agencies, I put up those 4 because they're the statutory agencies that exist. ScotFin and SMASH is a kind of a virtual, it's a space, it's a place to work in. It's beyond the routine governance because that allows us to be nimble. It allows us to operate in ways which I'll come on to, which the 4 agencies actually quite like and want to explore more fully. But why do we need a conversation? We spend a lot of time talking. We always do. But conversations suggests a degree to which we are communicating with each other for a purpose. Now, we all have that shared purpose. The problem is, as that kind of interconnected network suggests, between 4 agencies in Scotland, they have a shared purpose, but they don't actually have shared duties or powers. Their responsibilities are different. Their relationships are different. If we talk about Health Protection Scotland, theirs is fundamentally about environmental hazard protection and public health. If we think about Scottish Natural Heritage, they're in the business of planetary health and resilience, but ultimately it's about natural environments. The people within that natural environment need well-being, but actually at the end of it, their powers are within the place, not the people. Health Scotland, absolute commitment to reducing health inequalities because social and economic determinants, as we see, derived and co-varying with planetary health requirements, actually affect those who are already disadvantaged disproportionately. And CEPA, well, CEPA is a statutory regulatory body, but it also has well-being promotion. It's also looking to create environments and spaces where people want to live and are safe to live. Now, yeah, we can say planetary health brings us together, but it doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't actually allow us even to work together in the same kind of way. I'm not expecting you to see this slide. You can look at it afterwards. I asked all of my collaborators to produce me a slide that summarized how they were working towards this shared purpose. Now, apart from the fact that, as we've already heard this afternoon, how we represent, how we visualize what we do is a kind of challenge in its own right. These are describing processes. They're describing spheres of influence. They're actually trying to describe a series of objectives against which we are being performance managed. They're not necessarily a space that allows you to explore what you might do together. A place where you can actually step beyond what we have to do towards the things that help us develop ourselves as a community of agencies before we even think about the communities of interests that are the Dunkells, that are the Burnhams, that are the South Edinburghs, that are the Ardnamurchan Peninsulas. So, what is it we're trying to do here? Well, actually, we kind of came to an amazing conclusion, and that was that collaboration and governance is actually not a solution. It may be a problem in its own right. That if we're not careful, our ability to seek shared governance actually becomes the process by which we agree to do those things which we can do together and which are new. It's very good. That they actually become themselves resource intensive. So even the people who want to collaborate use their spare time to collaborate rather than necessarily even generate the necessary funds to do the day job. How many of you actually feel that? That you're spending so much time creating money for other people to do the things you'd really want to do yourselves and have the real fun? We also recognize that it became what you did, but it didn't become what you do in terms of the everyday, and that's a problem. So what we were actually asking ourselves was, where do we create that space beyond governance? And we said, well, actually, we have got an organization, it's called SMASH, the Scottish Managed Sustainable Health Network. It was originally set up to actually provide a collaborative space beyond routine NHS health board governance systems and structures. It was about trying to get into the position, not so much of saying, let's create what's new, it's let's encourage and animate what should already be happening across the health sector. And hey, guess what? We reckon that might actually help us for planetary health. Not because it's a new thing, but because it's a way of contemplating what we do already. That what it's actually doing is allowing us to co-create outside of our ordinary governance to then carry that back into the way in which the agency operates. No shared action plans, just the action plan that's common to the agency, but a clear line of sight to what it is you're contributing towards SMASH. Not a coming together on the things we can agree to do, but a recognition of where we co-create with each other those which are parts of the statutory duties and responsibilities that help us achieve our shared purpose. And no regression to the mean. No ability to just simply settle down into what we can afford to do. Because none of this actually takes money. It just takes commitment from agencies to allow us to think outside of our usual boxes. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that, and also for the best acronym, I think, of the conference so far, SMASH. Next, we have Stephen Bridgeman. He's a physician and a nature warden. He's the Clinical Director of Public Health, Nelson Marlborough Health in New Zealand.
Thank you very much. Kia ora, everybody. Can I just ask everyone to stand up, please? That's hello from New Zealand. Can anybody who's never been to New Zealand sit down, please? Good. Okay. And can anyone who's never lived in New Zealand sit down? Okay. And anyone who's still living in New Zealand can stand up and everyone else sit down? Okay, thank you. No, I thought it would be good after sitting so long just to have a bit of exercise, which I thought would be good for everybody. But it also says, amazing how many people have been to New Zealand, isn't it? 140 years ago, New Zealand introduced a new cable system. You could get a message on a telegram in 4 days from New Zealand to London. And I was thinking now in 24 hours you can sit in a bit of metal, be propelled, by 4 fossil fuel-powered hairdryers and get all the way across the world. But there we go. That wasn't in my script. Today I'm very honoured to be asked by Liz to talk about New Zealand. Unfortunately, my Maori colleague, collaborator, Dita Tamatea, can't make it, but he says hello as well. If I move on to the next one. Thank you. Yeah. So the objectives of my talk are to look at briefly Maori Worldview, Kaitiaki Tunga. Has anyone heard of that word, by the way? Hand up if you've heard of Kaitiaki Tunga. Nobody? Good. Resource management, a few, sorry, my apologies. And then practical examples. We had the Pope earlier. I'm pleased to say that this particular mountain range, and there's 3 national parks in my bit of New Zealand, is named after St Arnold, who is the patron saint of beer drinking. But there we go. He saved a lot of lives by introducing alcohol in the 10th century where there was water pollution. That's the Motueka River in South Island, New Zealand. Does anyone know who the guardian of that river is? I wouldn't expect anybody to, but it's the Ngāti Awi tribe, or iwi, and they exercise Kaitiaki Tunga with the strongest customary authority over this particular river, the delta and the catchment. They consider Kaitiaki Tunga is both a right and a responsibility associated with the land. They consider this river both an ancestor and a relative that they need to protect. They also believe they have an eternal duty to retain the life force or Maori of the things such as this river. And as the guardians of this river, they consider success is handing down resources, including this river, to their grandchildren better than they were taken on. So, Maori Worldview. The Maori Worldview considers all elements of the natural world are members of the same family and therefore logically to be treated as relatives. So damage to the river by pollution or the clear felling that the British did were considered assaults on relatives and unethical. An example from the Ngāti Pro tribe in the North Island was, we do not just share a relationship with our environment, our identity, our knowledge and our worldview is built on it. They also don't claim ownership of land, but rather our right is based on mana or natural power through their ties to the land. And in many ways, the Maori worldview is very similistic to the animistic religions and what we heard from the gentleman from the Dene culture earlier. And on the right, you no doubt have seen some of the Western views. So very interesting difference. I was going to say, this is, you could say, the love story. It's quite interesting, having again heard from some of our religious leaders earlier, that there's just tends to be one male-dominated leader. The Maori world has both a male and a female. And the creation story is that Ranganui, who you can see up here, was the Sky Father, and Papa, the Mother Earth, and they were so in love they clasped onto each other. And they had many children, including gods of trees, birds, people, winds, and waters. I think, as we heard earlier, the words probably don't translate into English, but that's what they had. The children then devised a plan, and we heard from some fantastic children earlier, and they separated their parents, and then the world was born. And the Maori name for Indigenous people is Tunga Ata Whenua, the people of the land. And they have a very close relationship with the natural world. And logically, in Maori philosophy, we are related to the natural world, given everyone's ancestors are Rangi and Papa. Then, going forwards, in 1840, the British Crown and the Maori signed the Treaty of Waitangi, which was supposed to provide an understanding between them. While it was intended to create unity, different understandings of the treaty and breaches have caused conflict. And for many years, Maoris, like many other Indigenous people, suffered non-compliance with the treaty, including land grabs by settlers. The treaty was supposed to embody a principle of partnership and a duty to act reasonably and in good faith. However, in New Zealand, times have changed. In the 1970s, the Maoris raised their grievances and the planning regimes began to gain credence. There was highly publicised protests. Recognition of the land interests in environmental legislation first occurred in the Town and Country Planning Act in 1977. In the 1980s, there was a series of landmark environmental cases regarding the interpretation of ancestral land and the relationship between Maori land and water. The government decided, or were persuaded by Maoris and others, to have Maori values with environmental law, and that included the concept of kaitiaki-tanga that I'll come on to, and the Treaty of Waitangi Principles, and the Resource Management Act was established in 1991. Now, the Resource Management Act is New Zealand's principal legislation for environmental management and town planning. And what I said earlier is ultimately these sort of laws across the world are really key issues for planetary health, because everywhere there are planners making decisions, as we know. At the time, in 1991, this was said to be novel in having sustainability at the apex of its legislation. No other country had it at this stage, and really this was because of its incorporation of Maori values and interests. And the Maori references throughout the legislation provide a gateway to the spirituality and cultural symbiotic relationships between the people of the land, which is the Maori, and the environment. So the Resource Management Act takes into account the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, requires local authorities to consult with Indigenous people, which is the iwi and the iwi authorities, to take their views into account in the planning documents and legislations, and to record the area over which they access kaitiaki-tanga, which is actually guardianship. So the Maoris looking after the land for future generations is now within New Zealand law. And then it provides the development of joint management agreements. What this has led now is nearly 30 years of case law of using these principles, a mix of indigenous values and Western values in the resource management law. And here are just a few examples. Oops, sorry about that. So one of them is about treatment of discharge of sewage into land, and I'll come on to one example in a minute of practice. Another one is the building of subdivisions and residences. Here we have what we do with forests, and here's a 2,000-year-old tree, 95% of which were removed within the first 100 years of European settlement. Seas and how you deal with pollution from wrecks. This particular river, a sixth of erosion from New Zealand goes down this particular river. How this is now remediated, because the problems have been created by deforestation and you could say rampant capitalism. And then new problem of farming salmon in some of the beautiful sounds we've got. So the example that I will just take briefly is Gisborne on the east coast. And it was fair to say Captain Cook felt that sanitation was better in New Zealand than it was in Madrid in the year 1773. So much for some of Darwin's views that actually some of these cultures were backward. They're actually far from it. Maori don't like to mix waste and fresh water, and that in some ways is the precautionary public health principle they've had for a long time, whereas the British, unfortunately, were mixing wastewater. What happened, though, after 1970s and 1980s is the kaitiaka, or guardians, which were the Maori rights and people of the land, battled in the courts and battled with local government and persuaded improvements in sewage to try and prevent what we've still got, which is what we have here, is people basically surfing in raw sewage, not being able to eat the shellfish, and in fact they are likely to turn it back by having ponds and marshes again, so people will be able to swim in this water. So here are some of the thoughts of kaitiaki-tanga, which is really guardianship. That word means guardianship if you translate it to English, but it's much, much wider and you can't really totally translate it. Every Maori person is a kaitiaka, so some of the iwis have a responsibility to look after places as guardians, as members of the community. And this was what Hari Parata, one of the lead Maori agitators or people said. Kari tree is my relative. Maori are the oldest inhabitants of Auckland, and they are at 2,000 years old. In fact, many of them were around, or the species was around at the time of dinosaurs, are that old. We've nearly destroyed all of them, but there are still a few left. And you have to do kaiatitanga every moment of your life. And I suppose I reflected on Andrew Murray there, who commented we can all take actions every day in our own communities. And in many ways, this was the view of Maori. And it's about compassionate concern for everything. So ultimately, to summarize that, I think that quote, perhaps for me, is, I think, quite an interesting one. And that was from the tribe in the north, the Ngāti Peru. We have no other land or sea. Our well-being identity as a people is entirely dependent on the well-being of our environment. So the New Zealand model of combining indigenous cultural methods, the concept of guardianship and sustainable practices into its planning structures should be considered as a critical response to addressing environmental concerns in any jurisdiction. I know my conversations with colleagues from Canada felt there was quite a lot that people might learn from the New Zealand model. However, the other key aspect, as we said, is the Maori world philosophy is that guardianship is all our responsibility, every citizen. So in summary, I've just talked around the Maori worldview. If you've not heard of it, then just introduce you to that. Introduced to the term which perhaps most of you haven't heard of, kaiatitanga, just a small introduction you may be interested to look at further. The Resource Management Act, which is nearly 30 years old, has a huge case history, an environment court where issues can be and are looked at every day. And then some practical examples of where this philosophy and the Maori philosophy has been impacting positively, turning back some of the problems that have been created by the British colonisation of New Zealand. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's inspiring to see the Indigenous principles being literally embedded into successful case law over time. Next, we will hear from Robert Engelman. He is a senior fellow of the World Watch Institute. He is a writer and journalist. From 2011 to 2014, he was president of the World Watch Environmental Think Tank, and he will talk to us about consumption and population.
I don't think there's going to be any exercise. I won't actually ask you to do any exercise. There won't be any video, but fair warning, there may be some explicit images and a little sex education in this talk. I'm grateful to the Planetary Health Alliance and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to address two topics, consumption and population, which are rarely addressed, but I think really at the foundation of everything we've been discussing the past 2 days and we'll discuss tomorrow of planetary health. There are probably about 2 other people in the world who are courageous enough or foolish enough to take these issues on together and deal with them and try to gain some expertise and make a difference in it. And I think I'm the one that has a new pre-raised family at Edinburgh, my daughter having recently married a Scotsman, so here I am. There are a lot of misconceptions around these ideas, and some of them I'm going to try to take up today. They're seen as difficult, sensitive, and controversial, and that's understandable, but I don't think they have to be. As a matter of fact, much of my work, and I've been writing and lecturing and actually teaching a brief course at Yale College on this topic for a number of years, and I've been trying to convey the idea that these are ideas that are really at the root of planetary healing as well as planetary ill health. They're very positive concepts. And they have tremendous potential, but it takes a little bit of attention to some of the details about them and a little bit of mind-opening and imagination to see what their potential is. And the reality is that it's a great topic for the solution space at this conference, because there are governments and there are non-governmental organizations and intergovernmental agencies and institutions that have been working in positive ways on these ideas to successfully address them. And those of us concerned about planetary health can pay attention and help. So this is a mountain of discarded plastic waste somewhere on planet Earth, and you can just imagine the millions of tiny pools of water that can collect on this mountain and be places that can nurture mosquitoes and contribute to dengue fever and Zika and all the other mosquito-borne illnesses. So this is a clear image of what some of our problem is in planetary health. And there are a couple of distinct ways or reactions you can have to this image. One is you can say, wow, we really use way too much plastic. And the other is you can say, wow, there really are too many of us in the world. Or it might be a mix of both of these reactions. And I can tell you you're okay no matter what your reaction is, because there isn't any particular scientific consensus as to what extent this is a population issue, this mountain of plastic, or to what extent this is a consumption issue. So you're good. But where there is scientific consensus is that human pressure on the environment is the product of both population and consumption. Obviously mediated by technology, the technologies we use that affect the environment, and I would add complicated or mediated by lots of other things, including structures of power and wealth, patriarchy, the status of people, genders individually. But it's the scale of our presence multiplying the way we behave individually, which of course is complicated by all these other things I mentioned. But even putting inequality in the mix, and we have to, it's clear that the problem is not population or consumption, but the interplay of both. I would give a Scottish pound for every time I've told people what I do, and they've said, well, of course it's not really population, is it? It's consumption that is causing the problem. And that's a little bit like saying it's not the width of a rectangle, but the height, or vice versa, that's causing the area of the rectangle. It's clearly both. And I think my mantra here would be that human scale matters, human behavior matters. Treat them together. And I hope Wendy Ball will have noted that this is a perfect planetary health haiku. I'll say it again so you can check my syllable count. Human scale matters, human behavior matters, treat them together. And that's not only haiku, it's also a key message of this talk. But for the sake of time, both of this talk and for the time that we exist on the planet, I propose that we really treat them as, in effect, equal factors, and factors that are both huge and powerful in this area, and that both need to be dealt with simultaneously. I think you can argue that there's a bigger, quicker bang for the buck in dealing with consumption. You can make immediate progress in ways that you probably can't by addressing population, but we're in a long game here. We have urgency, combined with the problem that we intend or hope to occupy this planet for a very long time to come. I think that's part of the nature of planetary health too, the future, as some have mentioned, and both of these areas are important. So let's adopt as ground rules, certain ground rules, and I really appreciate the fact that Liz Grant talked about moral values, and I think she listed quite a few really good ones. I'm not going to repeat them, but it sets me up well for saying, if we're going to talk about these issues, because they've been controversial and difficult in the past, especially population, but really consumption too, why don't we just kind of restrict our space for acting in them a little bit and agree on a set of ground rules and say, okay, we're going to deal with these issues, but within these ground rules. And they are going to be, as Liz suggested, our moral values. And the ones that I would particularly cite and the ones that are common in working in population-related policy and have really been since a human rights conference in Tehran in 1968, in which the world agreed that every couple, and it was framed as couples in those days, I'll say a bit about that later, has the right to determine for themselves freely and responsibly the timing and spacing of childbirth, to a conference in Cairo in 1994 where a framework of rights for working, human rights for working on population, was very detailed and agreed on effectively by every country in the world. So they're commonly held values like the right to development, like gender equality, reproductive rights, and the right to self-autonomy, that is, to make the important decisions for your life yourself without being pressured or coerced by anyone else. Those are the basis. Now, I think when we get to consumption, if I have time, I hope I do, we may struggle with these actually a bit more than population. We're going to take population first because defying common perception actually shows greater promise for influence and also for fitting well within our ground rules. It's already a success story, but with a long way to go. I have to admit, and I hesitate to say this, I cringed a little bit when this line of Hans Rosling came up that we reached peak children. I tried to correspond with Dr. Rosling about this because none of the demographers that I rely on from my own data, and I'm close to being a demographer myself, but don't have that degree, were saying this. And in fact, the UN data, even at the time when Rosling was alive, showed that in fact, every year, the last years of his life, more babies were being born, more children were in the world. And in fact, I just checked the data to make sure I'm right. In the year since he died, sadly, he never responded to my request to discuss this data. In February 2017, again, there were more babies born, more children at each age, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, wherever you want to go. Now, I say that because I think data is really important. The former journalist in me really insists that we have good data. It's really hard, but I think we all know in this area that the best available data is what we want to use and work from. And also, we don't want to assume too much from the data. So the idea that there would never be more children is inherently problematic because population is actually really quite dynamic. There have been rises and falls in fertility. In my lifetime in the United States, fertility has risen and then fallen and then risen again, and recently it's been falling again. In the Depression, for example, fertility was almost at about 2 children per person in the United States in the 1930s, and then after the war it went up to 4, and I'm personally rather glad it did as a 3rd child. But then it went down after that, and then it went up again. So we really don't know, even demographers, when they say their best guess about the future, their best guess, they're talking about projections based on a sort of a no-surprise future. But if anyone's noticed, even at this conference, in the food discussions, we're now talking about feeding the 10 billion in 2050. And just a little while ago, in the New York Times column on environmental problems, it was about feeding the 9 billion. The reason we've gone from 9 billion to 10 billion, and let me just say we haven't gone from there, we're at 7.6, about 7.7 billion right now, is that demographers, somewhat to their surprise, have discovered that fertility has gone up a little unexpectedly in a number of places. Africa being probably the main area, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, some very populous countries. Fertility has either stayed stable or ticked up, and also in Europe, interestingly enough, which some people would say is a good thing, but from a planetary health perspective, maybe not so much, it's hard to say. But my point here is not to criticize Rosling, who I wish I had another Scottish pound for, if I had one YouTube viewer for every 10,000 of his. He did a great job of popularizing the importance of child survival. And his basic point was not a bad one. And ditto with Hannah Ritchie for bringing it up. We have made tremendous progress in population. There was a movie once called Honey, I've Shrunk the Family. Well, folks, we've shrunk the human family. In 1950, it was about 5 children per woman. It's now 2.5, almost exactly 2.5. Replacement fertility is generally considered to be about 2.1. And the bad news and the good news is actually demographers are surprised by this. It's not 2.1. It's more like 2.3 in the world as a whole for a very bad reason. One of which is that there's still a number of children who are not surviving, particularly in developing countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia. And the other reason people don't think about it much, but affects replacement fertility, is sex-selected abortion and the artificial ratio of more boys being raised than girls. You have to have more children so that you will have enough girl babies to replace each woman who is reproducing in the population. So in a sense, we're almost at replacement for a bad reason. And I think the goal of population policy would be to make sure replacement is 2.1, which is about as low as it can go, through assuring child survival and adolescent survival into reproductive ages. And then seeing fertility fall, not because somebody's pushing it down, but because it's falling from gravity down to what would be replacement fertility. And the gravity that I'm referring to would be the conditions that we create through population policy that allow fertility to fall rather than push it down. They would be conditions like the choice that everyone has, women and men, but women especially because they bear, last time I checked the data, 100% of all children, to make the choices that they want to make for their own lives. And conditions like real gender equity, so that women and men and boys and girls are all standing equal in the world. And when we create those conditions and when we have the health services, particularly the reproductive health services that make it possible, then these things can go down. My goodness, what is this flashing red light telling me? Well, let me try to say three things on this, because the main message I did want to deliver was on population. One is comprehensive sexuality education. I said I would say something about that, and I've shown you kind of a view of that on a community basis. I loved the fact that the Royal School of Dunkeld, Miss Pringle's class particularly, I think it was Reese, Danny, and Ellie right down here, had this love people for who you are with the transgender individual. Sexuality education is something that's rarely mentioned but has a huge impact on gender equity. The Me Too movement teaches people to understand each other, not to touch each other unless you're willing to be touched, and also has a huge impact on teen pregnancy and reducing fertility. The other thing I want to mention is that population health and environment projects around the world, which is a situation where conservation organizations are actually allying with reproductive health organizations to bring family planning into some of the most remote and wildlife-rich, biodiversity-rich areas in the world. I am here with Vic Mohan of our UK's own Blue Ventures, David Johnson of Population Sustainability Network, and others. We'd love to talk to you more about this concept. And what I'll say about consumption as I run back to my seat before I'm hooked is just that some of these same principles can be applied to consumption. I'll just go to the final image and say we can create the conditions where people value human relationships and they love to have for each other more than just simply time spent with things. We can do that through creative taxation, through choice editing, like actually banning plastic straws or plastic bags, which have been done in Kenya and Rwanda and other places, and simply allowing for shorter work weeks, maybe a universal basic income. But we can think about creating the conditions where consumption falls naturally, using almost as a model what we've already achieved in population and what we're hoping to achieve in the future by the continuation of this work. Thank you.
So continuing our tradition, why don't we take a moment, 1 minute or so, turn to the person next to you, discuss what elements or principles or ideas you pulled out of this part of the session, and then we'll open it up for some questions and answers. Take 1 minute. Thank you, everyone, for that conversation in the audience. We now could take some questions at the two microphones. If anyone would like to come up, we have a few moments to be able to do some Q&A with this part of the panel. Go ahead, please.
Hello, this is Vic Mohan from Blue Ventures Conservation. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Speak a little more clearly, introduce yourself again.
Sorry, yes. So this is Vic Mohan from Blue Ventures Conservation. Thank you, Bob, for the name check. I'm a practicing doctor still, as well as being medical director to a marine conservation organization. And when we listened to the communities that we served and when we tried to meet the needs that they were articulating to us, we ended up producing a family planning service for them at their request. And not only has this led to dramatic improvements in women's health, women's empowerment, it's strengthened their engagement in conservation. And it's been done within a rights-based framework. How do we reassure that everybody in this room that what we're doing is meeting a need, that what we're doing is listening to communities and we're giving them what they're asking? How do we reassure people that there's nothing coercive or controlling about any aspect of that?
Thank you for that. Robert, do you want to perhaps take that principles-driven awareness of the 220 million women who want contraceptives and who can't get it, and yet a very checkered history? How do we ensure that we are truly partnering with the community?
Well, it's logistically difficult, but an organization that I used to work for when this was more possible than it is now made a point of bringing legislators to family planning clinics around particularly the developing world. And nearly all of them, when they came back and actually saw how much interest there was and how client-focused these health facilities were, and actually interviewed the women and the men who were there to get services, they came to understand that this was nothing close to population control, but was really meeting a felt need that was out there. And came back and had a different view about supporting the United Nations Population Fund, the Title 10 in the United States, which funds family planning in the United States, and I might say is under direct threat right now, unfortunately, in the current government. So it's probably not possible to bring all of you to a family planning clinic to see it, but here's something I would urge each of you, whether you're Scottish or here in the UK generally, or wherever you're from in the world, I would be extremely surprised if there isn't a reproductive health clinic or a general health clinic that offers reproductive health in your area. And I would, especially given your interest in planetary health, I would urge you to seek out those clinics and those practitioners and just say, so I've learned a little bit about family planning lately, don't know much about it, but why don't you tell me what it's all about and what it's like, and could I speak with someone who is lining up to get services? I think that would be a big help. Absent that, I think we have to keep telling the story that I'm trying to tell today, and again, I'm grateful to the conference for bringing me here to do that, and just finding ways, videos, social media, whatever, to say, no, it isn't population control. It's actually decontrol. It's releasing control to individuals, and particularly to girls and women, to develop their lives the way they want to develop their lives and to support them in that effort.
Thank you, Robert. Mandeep, did you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add to say that I think, looking at the example from reproductive health and from HIV, there's a slight nuance, but a very important nuance, that is something that, you can listen to communities and say that you're responding to the needs. But I think there's some brilliant work that's been done by a British academic named Robert Chambers on actually ceding power to communities and letting communities really be at the core of delivering those services and of leading on the issues that are important to them. And that helps get out of this, you don't need to convince anybody you're doing the right thing if the communities are the ones leading the response. Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, interesting approaches like in Brazil with community-based budgeting, where the community determines the health budget and therefore the services in their locale. Is there a question on that side? Can't see.
Yeah, hi. Emily Fleece from University of Tasmania. I was just speaking with Jeff about how we love New Zealand, and it's this wonderful place. It's welcoming and beautiful. And I think part of the reason it feels so welcoming is that they have really embraced the Maori culture in the more dominant culture, and teaching Maori languages in schools, and you just really can feel that embracing of that culture. And I'm just curious if there's any lessons that we can take from New Zealand to apply to other countries to listen to the native peoples and their beliefs and their culture.
Thank you. Tasmania itself obviously is a beautiful part of the world. I think the key bit for me would be on global governance, would be bringing those native cultures into the legal system. So there is a legal responsibility to listen. Clearly, those making decisions, as we've heard earlier, there's lots of trade-offs that need to be made, but it's really important those voices are listened to. And in New Zealand, what I think is interesting in the innovative laws is bringing the Maori traditional views as part of law. So words that I hadn't heard of before, like kaitiaki tanga, and maybe you've heard of, are actually part of the law in New Zealand to be taken account of, and they're built up from bottom up from communities with, in this case, Indigenous views that in many ways are really, really interesting. And I think we heard earlier from from the Iona Trust, saying that Christianity in many ways is coming in really late, and on the back of Christianity it's created a lot of problems. On the other hand, you could be saying native views actually, as we said, are planetary health views, aren't they? I mean, that last quote could have been said by the lead, by Sam yesterday. So I think the key bit would be to support your Indigenous communities to make sure their values are part of law and planning law, because ultimately across the world, planning laws are really powerful in helping environmental decisions being made. So apologies for talking too much, but the one thing is get it into the legal system, I'd be saying. That gives power then to Indigenous populations. And those of us that would support their views. Thank you.
One more question on this side.
Hi, my name is Enrique. I'm with the World Organization of Family Doctors and at the Working Party for the Environment. This question would be more specifically for Robert at the World Watch. And it's interesting that you came up with this discussion about the reproductive orientation services, and I'm very concerned with this that you called letting gravity pull down the number of child to the replacement 2.1 number, and I wonder if the demographers, do they discuss what kind of services should be offered? We're discussing now the universal health access to most people, and in many developing countries, it's not quite clear as it should be which model to follow. I'm talking, for instance, about Brazil. Okay. It's very confusing right now which model to follow. So my view, of course, I'm a family physician, is that the more integrated the services, the easier it would be to let it drop. So we are here trying to reach a transdisciplinary approach, and I think that the solutions should move in that direction as well. So I guess my question would be, how do you see these services? Should they be more segmented, or should they be more transdisciplinary, or as I envision family practice?
Well, I think you've pretty much said it all. I guess I would just add that there has been an evolution in the delivery of family planning toward integrated services, integrated health services. And I think one of the most important concepts, and we're still a ways from it, is seeing reproductive health and sexual health as critical to primary health. Essentially, primary health is often seen as something quite separate from family planning, but at really every age, people need to learn about and have and be treated for to encourage healthy sexuality and healthy reproduction. So the best services are those, particularly reproductive health itself is an integrated concept that embraces HIV prevention and prevention of all sexually transmitted disease, safe pregnancy, safe motherhood, antenatal visits, postnatal visits. They're indicators on all these things. And the best health care provides all of them, and then provides family planning, not, I might add, by saying, you want planetary health, don't you? You want a stable world population. Here, take this condom. But just simply honoring the principle that sexual well-being is basic to individual well-being, sexual and reproductive well-being, and saying this is part of the suite of the services we offer. The only thing I would add to it is that it's actually more interdisciplinary than that, because some of the barriers to people accessing family planning are lack of information, lack of good education, fear of side effects, which sometimes has some justification but often doesn't, and then social and family barriers, mothers-in-law who are against it, things of this kind. So it can't just be up to the family doctors, although I appreciate you're doing what you can do. It has to also be up to educators, political leaders, and people in communities to say, how do we remove the barriers to sexual and reproductive health, just as how do we remove the barriers to planetary health and primary health?
Thank you. Let's take one last question, and then we'll move into our next phase.
Hi, Kathy Baldwin, Social Science, University of Oxford. It's a question for the gentleman from New Zealand. I'm really sorry, I can't remember your name. I've just written part of a book on how the Maori in Christchurch were fantastic after the earthquakes and their values in terms of sharing and hospitality, family connection, needing to talk, acting for all people, regardless of race, ethnic background, culture, etc., to help. Were just incredibly helpful at that time in terms of resilience and rebuilding and helping people to come together and cope and address the collapsed elements of the city after those nasty disasters in 2011 and 12. Now, in terms of places that experience turbulent events and environmental disasters as a result of climate change and general global environmental change, and we know these are on the increase, then that sort of set of values ought to be enshrined in law everywhere. I just wondered if, in terms of your climate resilience strategy and your environmental resilience strategy in New Zealand, whether that element of the Maori response had been factored in at a policy level for future.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and your obvious expertise on that. The answer is yeah, it is round the table. Each health authority has a Maori health leader. So one of my co-authors here was our director of Maori Health. So yes, it is part of it. And for those of you who have not been to New Zealand, it is a really interesting experience. If you go to a traditional welcome or mihi, it just shows you some of that community-based spirit. And yeah, I think the answer is yes on that. And it's for those of you who haven't been there, I'd encourage you to go to New Zealand and learn around some of those cultures. And I think it's bringing it into the modern world, I suppose, is the key aspect. So some of those values in the modern world that was very different than in 1773, if you see what I mean. But the human factors are still incredibly important. So the answer is. Yeah, they are still there, and just reflection, if I might, while I'm in Edinburgh, and we heard about Charles Darwin, wasn't it, being earlier about being a leader on evolution. I was given his book when I went to work in the Antarctic by my mother, and he was talking about some of the tribes in Terra del Fuego, for instance, which are not unlike some of the Maori tribes, being backward and halfway to the missing link. And I think some of the early explorers really missed the advanced nature of some of the cultures in how to adapt to the environment. And there are an amazing amount of lessons for us to learn from our, to be honest, and sorry as I'm British, ignorant way that we've been dealing with some of the forests, cutting them down and plonking foreign animals and foreign trees. And we heard the Brazilian person earlier talking about using some of the native things.
So thank you. I'd actually like to thank Phil, Stephen, and Robert for their part of the panel. Mandeep is going to stay, and I'd like to now introduce Natalia Lanu. She's a social epidemiologist. She has done a portfolio of work at the city level in New York City, as well as now at the UNDP. She's going to facilitate conversation with our next set of colleagues, who will come on up to the stage, and she will introduce all of them. A dramatic start on all our behalf.
So we are the last panel of the day, and the challenge is to keep it exciting and entertaining for the next 45 minutes. So there will be no slides, and it'll be a conversation, a set of questions that I'll direct to some of the panelists. And to begin, I'm actually going to ask them to introduce themselves and to say one insightful or surprising thing they've heard today that will change the way that they work moving forward. And I'll start with myself, actually. This morning, the art panel said there was a hypothesis that planetary health is not succeeding because we're not engaging with the art community enough. And since we're based in New York City, I take on that challenge, and when I go back, I'll try and engage with some artists in New York. Mandeep, if you allow that for me. So let me start from, Mandeep has already been introduced, but maybe you want to say something that has surprised you the last few days, and we'll go down, and then I'll start with the question and answer session.
Not surprised, but I'm actually really, I feel quite energized and empowered by how many interesting lessons there are, I think, from multidisciplinary work in this field, and I think there's a lot more that we can do to really try and bring that to scale. So I think there's real opportunities to bring together different disciplines, and we've heard that throughout the presentations, both the presentations on the science and the data and evidence yesterday, but also today on the different sectors that they're coming together. But somehow we now need to get it to all add up to something more than the sum of the parts.
Thanks. Tim.
Hello, I'm Timothy Boulay. I lead the Climate Change and Health program at the World Bank. And this program aims to link up climate change and health considerations. And this is both for our health portfolio, but also the breadth of our work in transport and agriculture and environment and so forth. I also work on the One Health program. There is a small core of us that are attempting to bridge these diverse interests, mostly focused on infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance across the institution. Likewise, have been very similarly impressed throughout these past couple of days. Really interesting programs of work. Nice to see kids involved. And I think something that I'd like to sort of emphasize is this notion of speaking truth to power. And this, I think, works at many levels and within different institutions, whether it's kids speaking to adults or students speaking to teachers, or speaking within your own institution and using your own institution as leverage to get other institutions and other power brokers on board, I think is a very important concept that we as experts and emerging experts in this field should remember to amplify the impact of planetary health.
Thanks, Sophie.
Good afternoon. Is that working? Good afternoon. I'm Sophie Howe, or Prynawn Da, as we say in Wales. My job is as Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I've been particularly pleased to hear over the course of the day today the bringing together of a number of different disciplines, and in particular the way in which culture has filtered into the discussion and discourse as well. In Wales, we are the only country in the world that has legislation which protects the interests of future generations under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and not only does that give me what I think is probably one of the coolest job titles in Wales, to act as the guardian of the interests for future generations, but actually it sets out a requirement on all of our public bodies, our policymakers, Welsh Government and all of our institutions to take decisions which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it sets out other duties, perhaps which I'll talk about a little bit later, around improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. And that addition of culture is one of the areas that makes our legislation in Wales quite unique. And so I've been really interested to hear today how this theme of culture, the discourse with Indigenous populations and communities, the recognition of how people's culture and heritage actually connects them to the land is also really important and is a key part of our legislation. So it's good to see that coming out here too.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kulsum Ahmed. I've worked in international development with the World Bank for 25 years on environment, natural resources, sustainability and climate change topics. I'm currently working to raise attention to environment, climate, and related public health challenges and solutions in Pakistan. I've been impressed, again, as others, with the multi-sectoral discussions the last 2 days. One example, though, that I particularly wanted to highlight that inspired me was the presentation this morning by Sharon Flieger from the National Health Service, Highland. She was talking about how the NHS Highland was working to both inform and empower doctors to consider the waste aspect of prescription medicine. And I thought it was such a neat example of giving information and empowering a group to actually do something, but leaving it in their hands in a sense to make the trade-offs and to make the right decision as to what to do. Thank you.
So hi, my name's Catherine Trebek, and I work for a tiny, new but extraordinarily ambitious organisation called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and our ambition is really to try and galvanise a movement to try and change how our economic system works, and so that it's one that's orientated to deliver human and ecological well-being. And so thinking of what has inspired me or surprised me today, actually, I'm surprised. I thought you'd all say the Children's Parliament, so I thought I'd better think of something different, because they certainly were extraordinarily inspiring. But I was thinking, well, if everyone else was going to mention the Children's Parliament, I better look for something else. And I've been loving gazing up at the roof of this extraordinary building, because not only is it beautiful, but it in a way captures how we need to change our economic system, because every single one of those beautiful panels is a strong woman representing music or poetry or biology or physics or mathematics. And I have a real sense that until we have an economy that works for women and for girls around the world, we're not going to get a well-being economy. And so this roof, I find, has been a really lovely touchstone to keep my sense of where the conversation needs to go. And I hope we can all keep that beautiful image of women at the forefront as agents of change, but also very much the objective, how we need to go about changing and what that change looks like.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and I'm proud that we are a panel of strong women. So I'm going to follow up with 4 questions. Sorry, Timmy. It's rare, but all of us, I'm sure, have sat in panels where we have been the sole woman, so it's good to feel it. Okay, so I will follow with 4 questions. The first one will touch on governance, the second one on partnerships and innovation, the third one on translating research to policy, and the fourth one on advocacy and leadership. And not to bore you, I'm only going to ask 2 or 3 panelists to answer each. Then I'm going to ask them to engage with each other, because this is a rare opportunity. We've been doing it in silent, but to do it publicly, to see what we might disagree with each other, and then I'll open it to the floor, and hope to do that all in 45 minutes. So, the first question is that one critique of the planetary health frame is that it's too big, and our governance and accountability structures are simply inadequate to deal with such a big issue. So I wanted to ask a couple of you whether you agree with that critique. And Sophie, I'll start with you.
I'd agree that for many people it's quite a difficult thing to conceptualize. I guess, when you're sitting in the audience here, the good news is you're here, so lots of you probably understand it. And if you don't understand it, the fact that you've come here to understand it is a good starting point. But out there, across our institutions, our governments, our city and state level institutions, there will be thousands and thousands of people taking thousands and thousands of decisions every day who have no idea what you're talking about. And I think that's part of the challenge that we've got here. Does that mean that we shouldn't continue to talk about this planetary health concept? No, I don't think it does, but I do think that there is something about us talking each other's languages. And the piece of legislation in Wales that I'm responsible for, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, started off its life as a manifesto commitment which said we will legislate for sustainable development. And I actually think that moved on in quite an important way, because if you ask the average person on the street what is sustainable development, they will probably tell you it's something to do with the environment, but probably won't be able to iterate that any more than that. And so actually I think the concept of the well-being of future generations, whether you're the First Minister of Wales or whether you're a bus driver, that's something that we can all get, this concept of what world are we leaving behind for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations to come. So it is difficult to put governance structures in place to do that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because they say it's impossible until it's done, and in Wales we are doing it. I mentioned the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I talked about the fact that it places these new duties on all 44 of our public bodies in Wales around improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, that no one of those areas takes priority over the other. So that's smashing through the sort of the habits of, well, not just one lifetime, but of several lifetimes where we've seen the economy take priority over the environment. But it also sets out a vision for the Wales that we want to see through 7 interconnected well-being goals, and that's the really important part. They're interconnected. So we have goals for a prosperous Wales, a more resilient Wales, which focuses on biodiversity, climate resilience, a healthier Wales on physical and mental health and well-being, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of thriving culture and vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. And the duties on all of our public bodies are not that the National Health Service takes on the health goal, because that's what they've traditionally done, but actually every single one of our bodies in Wales and the government itself has duties to set objectives to maximise their contribution to every single one of those wellbeing goals. And they then have to demonstrate that there are 5 ways of working that they're using to get us towards that. So they have to demonstrate to me and to the Auditor General for Wales that they're complying with the legislation by planning for the long term, taking decisions in a way which recognises the long-term impact of the things that they do, or sometimes the things that they don't do. They have to demonstrate that they're shifting resources towards prevention. They have to demonstrate that they're integrating their thinking across all of the goals. They have to demonstrate that they're collaborating with each other and with other sectors, and they have to demonstrate that they're involving citizens. So there we have, I think, a governance framework which is still fairly early doors, but we are a small nation in Wales, a nation of 3 million people, small enough to be agile enough to try new things, to innovate, but actually big enough that if we can make it work in Wales, I think we can make it work at scale elsewhere. Just one, a couple of other points very quickly. Yes, we've got legislation, but essentially, I call this the biggest cultural change programme that we've ever seen in Wales, because it requires us to completely transform the way that we do policy making in Wales. We're used to and comfortable with working in silos, talking our own language, and telling people on the other side that they're doing things wrong or they need to do things in line with the way that we do things. We're used to resourcing for the short term. Our systems, our structures, our performance indicators, our funding streams reinforce that short-term way of thinking, and I was taken by what Phil said earlier about governance in that respect is certainly getting in the way of doing the right thing. So, and also what he said that actually, we're used to when we're trying to change things asking for new money, and there is no new money. This is about fundamentally changing from the inside the way that we do business and actually just doing better things. So there is a governance structure. I think it's something that perhaps, the rest of the world, many parts of the world is looking at, and something which I think has real hope in terms of transforming policy making in Wales.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Great example, and thank you for linking in the accountability to you. That's really important. Timothy.
So I will speak to the global perspective, and I think that the global community has been working on these issues for years, and even though it's not explicitly planetary health, there are a number of examples that suggest that health and environment have been linked up for decades. The Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17. 3 are explicitly about health, 3 are explicitly about environment, and those underpin the other 11. The World Health Assembly has a number of resolutions on environment and health. The Paris Climate Accord for the first time included health in its introductory text. The Montreal Protocol on ozone includes health and environment considerations, of course, the Cartagena Protocol. The list goes on and on and on. That being said, I think it's important to now use a framework like this because it enables a couple of things. Discussing planetary health with researchers and students helps give them a platform and link to these global agendas that previously weren't as crystallized. Additionally, it opens up funding streams. There can be new tracks for planetary health research, and linking that to global agendas and bridging the links between research and policy, either at the local level or the international level.
Thanks so much, Timothy. Okay, we're going to switch to partnerships and innovation. And this question is about unexpected partners, someone that you wouldn't really think about as an active stakeholder in this agenda. And if you have had such partnerships, what have you learned from that experience? And let's start with Kulsum.
I wanted to go back to something Andy Haynes said in the opening panel about how there's a focus on economic growth in terms of how we think. One of the things that the World Bank has been doing is, they talk to finance ministers. That's usually the counterpart of the World Bank. And one of the things the bank has been doing is to try and express the health costs in terms of mortality and morbidity, in terms of lost productivity, in the same terms, the same language of the finance ministers. So often you hear about GDP has grown by such and such a percent. Well, the bank does that type of analysis in individual countries and to assess what is the cost of degradation, of environmental degradation in terms of health, and to talk about it as a percentage of GDP. So for example, in Pakistan, where I'm working, the cost of environmental degradation is 4 or 5% of GDP annually. One of the things we did was we actually worked with the World Health Organization and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to try and bring the temporal effect into account, and primarily looking at malnutrition-mediated impacts and the effect on cognitive performance, and therefore what that means for productivity over a period of time. In developing countries, as you know, children under the age of 2 particularly are affected with repeated bouts of malnutrition and disease. And that often puts these numbers, doubles them. So the number, for example, in Pakistan became 9% of GDP annually when this was calculated. So this was kind of a conscious partnerships in order to advance that discussion, but unexpectedly WaterAid in the UK picked this up and actually used it to advocate in a big way for water and sanitation reforms in developing countries linked with the effect on health. And it was actually really neat to see Phil Landrigan's presentation and seeing that now those water-related diseases actually are not number one. Before they were number one, air pollution-related things were number 2 in the global burden of disease, environmental effects. So just trying to, so it's been interesting seeing you do something linked with your own profession and the best that you can do in terms of that discussion, but then it's interesting to see some others group take that up or some other partner take that up unexpectedly in order to advocate a broader case.
Thanks so much, Kulsum. How about Catherine? Do you have any unexpected partners?
Yeah, so something that Mandeep said in your talk earlier really brought home to me and summed up quite pithily some of the challenges that I think our world faces. And Mandeep, you said, responses depend on how power is exercised. And I think that captures, to a great extent, the nature of our geopolitical system that is still bound up around this GDP growth-orientated framework. I mean, the fact that we have to argue for health outcomes and argue through sanitation and argue for protecting the environment through the lens of this benefit to GDP just shows how captive we still are to that rubric of success, despite decades of evidence that it's bound up with a whole lot of perverse incentives. And I think it's quite easy to be in a room like this full of people who are passionately trying to put planetary health and communities and children and future generations at the forefront of policy making. But if any of you were here in Scotland on Friday, you would have been hard to think that any of us were making a dent in our work, because there was a report brought down by the ruling government party around growth, and all the media commentary was around how are we going to get more growth in Scotland, whether independent or not. And not one media question was about, do we actually need more growth? Is growth what we need for the future of a country in the 21st century? And I'll speak a little bit more about this tomorrow, but what's exciting in terms of unexpected partnerships is one of the little projects that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, We All, is working on, is bringing together, I think, quite brave, pioneering policymakers who recognise that in the 21st century, with the ambitions of the SDGs and all the challenges of not just climate change, but biodiversity loss and all the chemical pollution and all the breaching of those 4 planetary boundaries, plus the extent and multidimensional nature of inequality, plus the extent of community alienation, that to continue on with that notion of economic development, that just faster growth equals success, is redundant. And so what we're doing is working with governments at state and regional level who want to pursue policy making to create a wellbeing economy. And what's exciting is that they want to do it together. They're recognising also that none of them have got it right. They're not there yet. There's a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions in their policy regimes, and so they want to learn from each other and collaborate and share best practice. But what I'm most excited about is the potential for this project called Wellbeing Economy Governments to start shining a beacon on the sort of policy making that is fit for all the challenges and the opportunities of the 21st century, the sort of policy making that deserves the attention of those children that we saw at lunchtime.
Thanks, Catherine. And now I want to ask you about research, and there's a ton of students in the room and researchers, and how do you feel as policy makers or as practitioners, what are the gaps that you may have noticed, and what may be the most effective ways to convince policymakers? As we heard earlier in the first part of this session, evidence doesn't necessarily translate into policy. So Timothy, I'll start with you.
Excellent, thank you. So critical. Good policy and good investment must be predicated on good research. So it's absolutely imperative that we rely on this community to inform our work. In this room alone, I'm looking around, and there's so many folks: Susan Annenberg, Chris Golden, Andy Haynes, Howie Frumpkin, Jonathan Patz, Phil Landrican, Sam Myers, Laura Fleming, a bit like I'm doing an Oscar speech here. All of these folks we've relied on to build our program. And I think we have a pretty good climate and health program and One Health program. And it wouldn't be possible without the work of these folks working in this field in building the basis for us to draw upon. And one thing that all of these folks have in common is that they've made their research accessible to us. It doesn't just exist in journals. They write comment pieces that go into journals, of course, but also newspapers. They reach out to policymakers and investors to try to amplify their work. So I think that there's essential need for this kind of discourse going both ways. We can reach out, but it's very helpful for researchers to reach out to us as well, so we can make their research actionable and implement the right kinds of solutions.
Great, and we'll give you our email addresses. Feel free to reach out now. Catherine, I'm going back to you, and if anybody else wants to jump in, let me know. Otherwise, we'll have an opportunity at the end. Yeah.
I've spent over 8 years working for Oxfam in a lot of various different research functions there, and so my job was really about trying to galvanize some of the research material that was coming out of different academic quarters and through the Oxfam filter, translate it into policy recommendations, and then try to translate that into policy actions. And so that experience has taught me a couple of things. One, to echo Tim's point, absolutely the accessibility of it is so vital. Paywalls are very 20th century. Don't play that game, and I think Edinburgh Uni is wonderfully at the forefront of the open access conversation, which is just brilliant. But also, don't get so bogged down in something that's so esoteric and specific we can't translate some of the messages. So be very careful of those rabbit warrens, because you get so deep into them you can't see the rest of the terrain. Also, don't get so tied up in parsimony that you're not unable to make a point. So think about the implications. Of course, be honest about the limits and the challenges of the research. That's vital. But don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, because no research is perfect. And the challenges are so real and so urgent, we need to get on and experiment. And so the better we can have your expertise and your inquiring minds at the heart of that experimentation rather than just focusing on perfection, we'll get somewhere. The other would just be very quickly around be clear on the implications. Don't just finish off a report by saying, oh, it's complex and we need more research. I've done it. But, I mean, come on, you're smart people. You stretch into the implication terrain, start making recommendations. And to go back to the accessibility point, use vehicles like The Conversation, which is absolutely a wonderful platform to translate that research into newsletters and spaces where other people will read it. Don't expect us to come and find it buried in your program's website that's badly designed and the reports are hidden behind many, many different tabs. And the other lesson I've had from, I guess, where I've been surprised at some of the work I've done, despite all its rough edges, has had an impact in policy making, is come at it from many different directions, get as many different messengers, whether it's colleagues in other parts of the sector, whether it's other agencies, whether it's different organizations, whether it's different platforms, communicating that message for you. So the key thing there is collaboration and making friends and making allies who share the implications in the sense that there's a message there that's worth communicating. So don't just be the only person speaking about this. Link up with others and make partnerships so there's a lot of different people speaking to the same voice.
Thanks, Catherine. This question is pretty popular, I guess, because we have a captive audience. Mandeep and Sophie.
Yes to everything that you've just said. My background is as a policy advisor to two former First Ministers in Wales, and I'm going to let you into some secrets. The first is that politicians don't read abstracts. Very, very rarely do they ever read abstracts. The second is a big and terrible secret that quite often policy making is made in the absence of any evidence whatsoever. And the reason for that is that sometimes they have no idea where to go to find the evidence. Your point about the kind of, in the deep, dark depths of a website is absolutely the case. To people sitting on the outside of academia, it's kind of, what you do is kind of like wizardry and dark arts. We don't quite understand, where to go or where to find it or what might be in there when we get there. So you need to find a way of kind of pushing that out. And I think Catherine's point about aligning with other people who are good at doing the communication, this whole wealth of NGOs, pressure groups, campaign groups, who, if you're able to work with them to translate your research or your product, they have loads of really good skills at actually translating that to policymakers. And then the final point that I would make is be willing to loan your brains as well as write your papers, because sometimes what policymakers want, they don't want a lengthy and very comprehensive piece of research on a particular topic, which often concludes with, we're not really sure and we need to do more research. By that time, the policy will have been made. That's why the policy often gets made in the absence of evidence. Actually, what they want to do is to borrow your brain, to have a frank and honest conversation with you in safe space where you're not going to throw rocks at them and tell them that they're completely wrong, where they're able to explain the parameters within which they're operating, the political realities, the resourcing realities, and between you get to a position where you find something that's the best policy that it can be in the circumstances. That might not fit exactly with what you recommend through a robust piece of research and evidence, but I think that's better than what we get at the moment, which is often the absence of anything at all.
Thanks, Mindy.
Two things. One is really the issue of scale and having a captive audience here. I think it's really important to have some research on how we go to scale with successful solutions and interventions to the planetary health challenge. And I think that's something that really we need to start investing in now. And one of the things that I've seen at UNDP over the years, that one of the things that's the most compelling for countries is to learn what other countries are doing, or for cities to learn what other cities are doing. So finding a way of communicating and translating research and sharing it quickly with peer groups, I think, is a really important thing to do.
That's a great point. Yeah. Okay, and the last question links a lot to this communication, is about how do we get the balance right between creating a sense of urgency while also not creating a sense of fatalism, and what type of leaders, what type of engagement with the public, what tools have you used? And Kulsum, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I want to actually go back to think global, act local, because I think that's kind of not just important at the upstream, but also on the local bit. And we've heard a lot about communities and also how one can empower them. So I think the only way not to actually get to a kind of despair situation is always to talk about solutions or the types of solutions that others have used, but yet leave the space for the community to use their own indigenous knowledge, to use their own history, to use what they know about their local environment to actually take their own decisions. So let me, as an example, talk about a World Bank project in Tajikistan, the Environmental Land Management and Rural Livelihoods Project. In Tajikistan, it's a mountainous area, it's a small country. A lot of the men are actually off working in other countries and sending money back home, so a lot of female-headed households. Severely affected by climate because the glaciers are melting, the water comes down too early, so you get landslides and floods in springtime, but in the summer when you actually need the water, there are droughts. And it's in this challenging circumstance, as I said, mainly women-led households, where under this project, working with actually NGOs coming in to work with communities to develop climate change adaptation plans at a community level. So the community itself does this with the support of the CSO, the NGO, and then resources are given to at the household level. And the household can decide what they do with that money. And it's not just grants, some of it is loans. And it's actually interesting how the accountability is there, and also with that knowledge, how those individual households actually move forward in a way that is consistent with that plan, even though there's no requirement that they actually follow that plan. So I think it's about giving support in order to empower households or individuals, but in the context of a community, because in the context of the community is really where you get the accountability and also where you get the impact in terms of multiple people acting together, for a particular goal. I think it goes literally back to think global, act local.
Thanks, Kulsum. Mandeep?
New leadership and unlikely leadership, and bringing together coalitions of people who wouldn't ordinarily be working on issues together. And I think I've heard, I can't remember which session I heard it in, about what the health sector is doing to reduce the harm, environmental harm that it produces, and that there isn't enough going on. And I wanted to share an example of good practice of something that UNDP hosted, which was an interagency task team on sustainable procurement in the health sector, where we were able to bring together a range of organizations as well as some of the biggest financiers of health programs to really reduce the harm caused from waste management, to reduce packaging, reduce medical waste properly, and now we're rolling that out together with Healthcare Without Harm to countries so that they can actually improve procurement within their health sectors. And we've got pharmaceutical companies that are now joining the alliance as well. So I think sometimes we have to start from looking for the unlikely leadership, and that leadership is really the responsibility of everybody in terms of reducing harm on the environment.
Thanks, Mandeep. Catherine.
That point on unlikely leadership, because I think that is the sort of leadership that will help us get through the challenges where the world's currently facing. And I forgot to tell you which countries that we're working with this Wellbeing Economy Government Group. And there are 3 countries that are really at the forefront of it at the moment that you probably wouldn't normally see linked together, other than maybe in sort of football rankings where they're just recent kickouts of the qualifiers for the World Cup. And it's Scotland, Slovenia, and Costa Rica. 3 really different places, 3 very different histories, 3 very different political configurations, different publics, different pressures, different challenges. And yet they're focusing on this shared goal of creating policy making together and working and collaborating together. And I think, and I should say, Wales are part of that project, and Sophie's been a huge advocate, so it's really exciting to work together to bring Wales and other countries into that picture as well. But I think it really speaks to the sort of leadership that we need, is that it's those people and those agencies and those businesses and those community groups that are prepared to go against the grain, that are prepared to put their head above the parapet and challenge that received wisdom. And not just challenge it verbally, but actually start doing something differently. And this new organisation, its raison d'etre is to try to celebrate and inculcate and replicate and amplify the work of those amazing organisations. And what's been really exciting about being here today is that seems what everyone else here is about too. It's about creating alliances and about really focusing on what's good practice and trying to replicate that rather than just continue with the same old system that is taking us quite literally into the ground. So to me, that's the sort of leadership we need, and it's already happening. That's the huge relief, I guess, is that we already know what that change looks like because they are those amazing, surprising leaders that are getting on and doing it.
Thanks, Catherine. And Sophie, did you want to add anything on this, on leadership?
Yeah, I mean, our legislation is focused on the public sector, but crucially, it establishes governance structures to bring different parts of the public sector together in each locality, and that's producing some really interesting results. So, for the first time, our National Environment Organisation, Natural Resources Wales, is sat round the table with all of the other public services, so with the police and the fire and rescue services and health and local authorities, and they're changing the nature of the discussion and the debate. So we've just seen in Cardiff, our capital city, a public health professional leading the debate on what Cardiff as a city should do in terms of transportation, and a white paper has come out which talks about planning for the future, which talks about congestion charges, which talks about clean air zones. And just today it's been announced actually that Cardiff therefore has been shortlisted to have a new headquarters for Channel 4, and the things listed were about these kind of interconnected things, the integrated transport, the fact that there's this focus on, livable and green city and so on. And so we're starting to see the nature of discussions and the different or unusual suspects come into a discussion change. And I think that that's really promising. I do think that we need kind of advocacy at all levels in order to build a movement. And when we talk about building a movement, we often talk about, citizens and communities. And of course, that's incredibly important. And, some of the brilliant things that have happened across the world have been because citizens have moved mountains. But I think we often forget about building a movement within the organisations that take decisions on a daily basis. There are thousands and thousands of people, across Wales and millions across the world who are taking decisions every day, who are helping to inform policy, who are writing policy. And, do they get what it is that we're trying to achieve here? Does the system that they're operating in actually help them to make the shifts, the sort of shifts that we're talking about here? And I've got this concept of a group of people out there in that policy making and kind of, public sector delivery world called the frustrated champions, who are the people who for a long time have been able to see that there's a better way of doing things, but the system, the process, the structure, the risk registers, the performance indicators, the budget have kind of frustrated them from doing the right thing. And some of my focus in the first 2 years of my appointment has been to identify those frustrated champions and to work with them, because I think so often when we try to do aspirational policy making like the Future Generations Act, I often think of it as a kind of triangle. We have kind of, innovation and good ideas at the top, and then we kind of have governance and, if we're lucky, resources at this side. And over this side, we have people. Absolutely crucial that we're working with people to help them shift, to help them understand the cultural change that they need to get to, because quite frankly, otherwise our triangle's going to topple over and we probably won't achieve what we set out to. So I think when we talk about a movement and we talk about advocacy, we need to be thinking about it from within as well as from the outside.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I think we have time for 2 to 3 questions if you have them, so come up to the microphones while I quickly just... we don't? There's 10 minutes left? No? There was discussion. We've decided for the group. No?
How about people? Yeah, you make a decision.
two. Okay, one to two questions. Sorry, we have. Okay, sorry, we're just. Go ahead, John.
Yes, Jonathan Patz. Regarding science communication, any scientist that takes federal grant money to do their research has an ethical obligation to take the conclusions and not just put them on the shelf and keep them in the lab or keep them in science journals. There's an obligation to communicate effectively back to the public. The public is paying for that. So it doesn't come by accident, and not all scientists can communicate, but there are wonderful programs out there. There's the Aldo Leopold Leadership Training Program that teaches scientists how to speak without jargon, and so there are tools out there, but I think it's a very important thing that scientists should take advantage of to learn how to communicate better.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
If only the policymakers could take science classes.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think some of the real success around HIV was because the scientists and the communities came together, and the communities understood the science, and the scientists really were able to understand the needs of the communities. And I think having that dialogue, and if it's federally funded and it's part of research funding, I think that's fantastic. But I agree with Timmy. I think policymakers should take science classes. That's true.
Go ahead.
Great presentation. And so, as the topic reads, I see the role of governments. Yet I'm conflicted because I don't see a true government partner there or a government official. Because at the end of the day, everything we do, even if we have such a sense of urgency, without having them being here to hear what we are talking about, it makes me just wonder whether we're just talking to an empty space. I know World Bank deals with governments, and maybe you'll go and sit down with them and say, if you have to get this money, you have to do this. How do we invite them to our conversation so that they feel interested in the things we're talking about? Because at the end of the day, they will implement whatever things we want them in their countries. How do we get them on board to these conversations? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I think that's feedback to the Alliance to invite more government stakeholders. And Sophie, I think you're the only one on our panel who represents government, so maybe you can take that.
Well, I'm independent of government. My job is to audit and hold government to account, so I can't claim to speak for government. But as someone who has previously worked in government, I think it's kind of what I was talking about in terms of us understanding the different pressures and that different sectors and organisations are under, and finding ways to not necessarily bring people into your agenda, but how can you reach out into theirs. Politicians, whereas I guess people who undertake specific pieces of research, you might live and breathe that specific area for a number of years. Politicians will go from talking about unemployability to climate change to saving a local school from closure to, their lives and the things that they have to deal with are like that. So you have to be able to understand that well in order to communicate with them, because they're unlikely to reach into your world because of the pressures that are on them. You need to be reaching into theirs. And I think if you do that, what then starts to happen is you both start stepping outside and meeting in a kind of common place.
Thanks, Sophie. Catherine, I know you want the floor, but I'm going to let the two people ask the questions, and then hopefully it'll be relevant still. Is that okay? Okay.
Hi, my name's Joey. I'm a medical student here. Picking on the theme about talking to the powers that be, I was shocked to kind of learn about the association between tobacco companies and Formula One racing, and how they're slowly moving races out of high-income countries into lower and middle-income countries based on the population of smokers that are more likely to be available. And I'm sure this is just one example of corporations doing this kind of act of working beneath a veil. And I wondered how can we take on this responsibility of calling them to account, and what kind of work can NGOs and governments do towards stopping this?
Thank you. Let's go.
University of Queensland. In Australia. I was wondering, Catherine, you specifically spoke a little bit about incorporating decision-making science in your processes, and I was curious among all of you if you've encountered an increasing space for decision analysis and decision-making science as relating to your policy decisions.
Thanks, and we have someone who has waited patiently. Go ahead, and then I will give the floor to Anne, and she'll wrap up, and hopefully if you have to answer, otherwise during the Q&A drinks, please approach people, because we are running late.
Manolis Kujivinas from Barcelona. It's great to have this panel, and it always, when we have this type of panels, you see how difficult it is to have transdisciplinary discussion. And how our discourse sometimes moves in different levels, in different wavelengths. So when Natalia asked you, what are the research priorities, the response we got is how we should write our abstracts. And I understand that it's very difficult to respond to this question in this context. It's really a very, very big issue. But the response we are expecting is not how we should write our abstracts in our reports. And I think it would be very nice if we could set up in the future some kind of discussions where we would talk about research priorities from different perspectives and identify the issues that we really need more research for policy and get this type of feedback from both sides. You know, and things like the story of indoor air pollution and the lousy data we have on child health, et cetera, a number of big issues that we don't have good data, and you may have identified other things that researchers may not have identified. So I think these are the issues we should be discussing in some of these transdisciplinary discussions.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I'll wrap up very quickly just to sort of summarize the wide-ranging conversation, but there were some themes here. It was nice to start with Mandeep from UNDP, because remember that Helen Clark from UNDP laid out the original role of governance in the Lancet report. And so it's important to keep coming back to these. We didn't go deeply into things like corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, but there are different models out there. We also heard from Stephen, and earlier in the week, Elder Paulette and Sophie about the importance and power of incorporating indigenous and community wisdom into actual legal and administrative code, and the power of action that can flow from that. We also had an emphasis on gender equity, which Robert and Catherine also brought forward, that you cannot address human rights until you're addressing the rights of women distinctly. So there's more room to go in terms of being able to communicate both the research that we do and the importance of research prioritization. I will say that Tony Lieserowitz at Yale and others have come up with guidance about how we should communicate these psychologically overwhelming facts to policymakers and to communities and others, and there's some good neuroscience and behavioral science around how to do that communication, and we should utilize that as people who are actively concerned about this important topic. And so I'll just close because someone said the word love sometime during that session, and just again this idea of action and urgency. The Elizabeth Bishop poem, there's a line where she says, love should be put into action. Policy and better governance are ways to do that, to actualize action. And also I'll quote Paul Hawken, the environmentalist, to paraphrase him, where he said, data may make us despair as we look at it around planetary health, but if you meet everyone working for the planet and the poor, you haven't got a pulse. If you meet everyone who's working on this issue and don't feel inspired, you haven't got a pulse. You all have a pulse. Thank you for your work.